Good afternoon, everyone. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new interesting videos. So, here's the thing. It was a hot, sunny day in mid-May, and I was in 8th grade, sitting in the back row of Mrs. Johnson's class. It's one of those moments that you look back on, and you kind of wonder what possessed you to do it. But hey, I was young, a little mischievous, and, to be honest, I thought it'd be funny. I had this piece of paper with two simple words written on it: "It's snowing." I mean, it was definitely not snowing, it was the middle of May, for crying out loud, but something about it felt like it could spark a chain of events. I showed it to my friend sitting next to me. His eyes widened for a second before he glanced out the window, and then we both started laughing. He realized, of course, that it was absurd. But I wasn't done yet. I passed the note to the next person, and the cycle continued. Each time I showed someone that same piece of paper, they'd immediately look outside, expecting to see snow, I guess, and then, they'd laugh, realizing they'd been played. It wasn't long before the entire class was in on the joke. At first, it was just a couple of people laughing, but then it snowballed, no pun intended. I could feel the energy building in the room as more and more people got in on the joke. There's something oddly satisfying about seeing people react the way I wanted them to, innocently confused, then completely amused. Each time someone looked out the window, I was secretly reveling in how stupidly simple it all was. But it wasn't just the students laughing. Mrs. Johnson, who was sitting at her desk, had started noticing the giggles and whispers. I remember her looking up from her papers, her eyebrows furrowing as if she could sense something was off. She probably hadn't figured out exactly what was going on, but I could tell she was about to. The class had become this chaotic, but hilarious, mess, and I was the mastermind behind it all. Or so I thought. As I passed the note to the next person, a feeling of power settled over me. Everyone was paying attention to me, and I could tell some of them were in on the joke and eager to see what would happen next. Little did I know, I had just set the stage for something that would go a lot further than I had anticipated. It wasn't long before Mrs. Johnson couldn't ignore it anymore. I'd passed the paper to one of the students in the front row, and when they looked out the window with that confused expression on their face, the whole class burst into laughter. That's when she stood up and slowly walked toward my desk. I could see the moment her eyes landed on the paper. Her face shifted from curiosity to realization, and without missing a beat, she looked straight out the window. The whole class erupted into laughter all over again. And that's when it hit me, I wasn't the only one being entertained here. Mrs. Johnson, my usually calm and collected teacher, had just fallen for it too. Now, I'd done a lot of stupid things in my life, but there was something especially funny about this. The teacher, the authority figure in the room, was just as gullible as everyone else. I think I even saw a small smile creep onto her face as she realized she'd been played, but her professionalism quickly snapped back. For a second, I felt like I had the world in my hands. The whole class was in on it, and Mrs. Johnson? Well, she was just another player in the game. But even as I felt that rush of triumph, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had gone too far. As the laughter died down, there was this weird silence that hung in the air. Everyone was still smiling, but I could feel the tension shift. Mrs. Johnson didn't say anything at first, but I could tell she was waiting for a moment to regain control. It was as if she knew she couldn't let the whole class think this prank had gotten the best of her. But in that moment, something inside me started to feel a little different. Maybe it was the way everyone had reacted, or how Mrs. Johnson had been caught up in it too, but it felt like the joke had lost its innocence. Sure, it was funny in the beginning, but now it felt almost a little mean. Everyone was laughing at Mrs. Johnson, and that made me uncomfortable. She was our teacher, after all, someone who had always been fair and kind to us. I'd never really thought about how she'd feel in all this, and suddenly, I was second-guessing everything. That's when I saw her face. She wasn't mad, but she wasn't exactly amused either. I could tell she was holding back her frustration. And that's when I started thinking, was it really worth it? It hit me that this small prank had escalated in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't just me laughing anymore. It was her too, and I didn't feel so great about it. The class eventually settled down, but the vibe was different. Mrs. Johnson went back to her desk, and for a few moments, the room felt awkwardly quiet. It wasn't like the usual fun, carefree atmosphere. I could tell a few of my classmates were still chuckling, but I could also see that some weren't as amused anymore. A few even exchanged uncomfortable glances, as if they were wondering if they'd crossed a line. Mrs. Johnson didn't say anything for the rest of the lesson. She just kept glancing over at me every now and then, probably wondering how far this would go. I couldn't help but feel a little guilty, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. The whole thing had started as a harmless joke, right? I mean, it was just a piece of paper with the words "It's snowing." No big deal. But there was a weird shift in how I felt about the whole situation. I started to realize that my joke had stopped being funny to me, and it was starting to feel like I had used everyone else, especially Mrs. Johnson, as the punchline. That feeling lingered with me, and for the first time, I actually began to feel a little bad about the whole thing. Sure, I was still part of the joke, and sure, the whole class was laughing along with me, but the excitement of pulling off a prank was fading. I felt like I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And the worst part? I knew that I had to face the consequences sooner or later. The rest of the day dragged on. Every time I passed by a classmate, I caught a glimpse of that knowing look in their eyes. Some people gave me a smile, but it wasn't the same carefree grin we'd all shared before. There was this weird tension in the air, like I was carrying the weight of the joke with me wherever I went. It wasn't just the students who were affected. I started to notice a shift in how the teachers interacted with me. It was subtle, but I could tell that Mrs. Johnson had lost a bit of her trust in me. By the time school let out, the excitement had completely worn off. I was still walking around with the "It's snowing" paper in my pocket, but it felt like a relic of something that had gone wrong. That feeling of power I'd once had was replaced by this nagging sense of guilt. I realized that I had been so caught up in the idea of making everyone laugh that I hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture. At home, I couldn't stop replaying the whole thing in my head. I kept asking myself if it was really worth it. Sure, I got everyone to laugh, but at what cost? I knew Mrs. Johnson would probably never mention it again, but I felt like something had shifted between us. And, even more so, I felt like I had to take responsibility for what had happened. In the silence of my room, it became clear, the prank wasn't just about snow or a piece of paper. It was about the way I had made others feel. The next day at school, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to make things right. I walked into Mrs. Johnson's class with the same knot in my stomach, trying to figure out how to approach her. I could tell she was trying to act normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. The tension was still there. She wasn't angry, but there was a quiet distance between us now. During lunch, I found myself standing outside the teacher's lounge, pacing back and forth. I debated whether or not I should say anything at all. I mean, what if she didn't care? What if she was just going to let it slide? But deep down, I knew I had to apologize. The guilt was eating at me, and I couldn't just let it go. After lunch, I went to her classroom and knocked on the door. Mrs. Johnson looked up, surprised to see me standing there. "Hey, Mrs. Johnson. Do you have a minute?" I asked, my voice unsteady. She raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course, come in." I walked in, feeling nervous as hell. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew what I had to do. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts before speaking. "Look, about yesterday. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for it to go that far, and I know I probably made things uncomfortable for you." I could feel the sincerity in my own voice, and I could see that she was listening. It was just supposed to be a dumb prank, but I realized now it wasn't funny the way I thought it would be. She looked at me for a long moment, and I wondered if she was going to brush it off. Then, she smiled, but it wasn't the usual teacher smile. It was more knowing, like she understood exactly where I was coming from. "Thanks for saying that," she said gently. "I appreciate your honesty. And I know it wasn't meant to hurt anyone. But sometimes, it's easy to forget that the people we're joking about have feelings too." In that moment, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't the grand, dramatic apology I had imagined, but it felt like a genuine connection. I had learned something important that day. Sometimes, the best way to solve a problem is to own up to it. After that conversation with Mrs. Johnson, I felt this strange sense of relief. It wasn't about getting her forgiveness or even making everything perfect, it was more about acknowledging that I had made a mistake and owning up to it. I'd always been the class clown, the guy who liked to get a laugh out of people, but that moment with Mrs. Johnson reminded me that there's a line, and sometimes, I didn't know where it was until I crossed it. In the days that followed, I started to pay more attention to how my actions affected others. I noticed how easy it was to get caught up in wanting to be the center of attention, to make people laugh at any cost. But what I realized was that the most genuine laughs come from a place of respect, not from manipulation or trickery. I didn't have to pull pranks or make someone the butt of the joke to get a laugh. Real humor comes from understanding the situation, the people involved, and knowing when to hold back. It also dawned on me that everyone has their breaking point. Mrs. Johnson had handled the whole situation with grace, but I could see that I had pushed her to a point where she wasn't sure if she could trust me. It wasn't about the joke anymore, it was about my integrity. Could I be the class clown without crossing the line? Could I make people laugh without making someone uncomfortable? I decided that I wanted to be someone who could still make people laugh, but in a way that was kind and respectful. That meant being more mindful of how my jokes affected others. I wasn't perfect, and I knew I wouldn't always get it right, but that conversation with Mrs. Johnson stuck with me. It was the first time I'd really understood that sometimes, the cost of a laugh isn't worth the price of someone else's discomfort. And from that point on, I promised myself that I'd do better, not just for my friends, but for myself too. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice a change in how people responded to me. The jokes and pranks became less about the shock value and more about just being real with my friends. I wasn't constantly trying to make everyone laugh at someone else's expense. In fact, the more I paid attention to my friends' reactions, the more I realized that humor didn't have to be forced, it could be a shared experience, something that brought people together, not something that put anyone on the spot. I also noticed a shift in how I interacted with Mrs. Johnson. The trust between us wasn't completely repaired, but it felt like we had an unspoken understanding now. She didn't treat me like I was a troublemaker or someone who couldn't be trusted. It was more like a quiet respect had formed between us, and that was enough for me. I didn't need to be her favorite student or the one she thought was the funniest. I just wanted her to know that I had learned something valuable. I think, for the first time, I truly understood the difference between harmless fun and crossing boundaries. Before, I thought that as long as everyone was laughing, it was all good. But now, I saw that the laughter had to come from a place of respect, whether it was a teacher or a classmate. It wasn't about being the center of attention, it was about making sure everyone felt included, not left out or tricked into doing something they'd regret. Looking back, I realized that prank might have been the turning point in my 8th grade year. It wasn't just about getting people to laugh at something ridiculous, it was about understanding the responsibility that comes with humor. It was about recognizing the line between funny and mean, and knowing that the best way to make people laugh is to lift them up, not put them down. That prank, in all its simplicity, taught me more about myself and others than I could have imagined. And it reminded me that sometimes, the hardest lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. As the school year wrapped up, I found myself reflecting more on everything that had happened. The prank had seemed so innocent at the time, but it had sparked a change in me that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't the same class clown I used to be, not in the same way, at least. Sure, I still liked to make jokes and mess around, but I was more mindful of how I did it. I wasn't looking for shock value or laughs at anyone else's expense anymore. One thing I learned from all of this was how important it is to understand people, really understand them. Humor isn't just about what's funny in the moment, it's about being aware of how your words and actions affect others. And that, in itself, is a kind of maturity that I hadn't fully grasped until that moment with Mrs. Johnson. She didn't just forgive me, she taught me something far more valuable than any prank or laugh I'd ever gotten. The rest of the year went by without any more pranks or major slip-ups, and by the time summer came around, I felt like I had grown a little. I'd come to terms with the fact that not everything in life is about getting the last laugh. Sometimes, it's more important to listen, be kind, and make sure your humor doesn't harm anyone. When I look back on that day in 8th grade, I can't help but laugh at how naive I was. but I also appreciate it for what it taught me. It's funny how a small, seemingly insignificant moment can change your perspective forever. I didn't just learn a lesson about pranks, I learned a lesson about being a better person. In the end, I think I came out of it stronger, more self-aware and better equipped to deal with situations in the future. And the next time I want to make a joke, I'll think twice before I do it, because I now know that the best laughs come from a place of kindness and respect. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Looking back, I realized that the prank wasn't just some funny moment in my school life, it was a turning point that helped shape who I became later. It taught me a lot about self-awareness, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with humor. I learned that being funny doesn't have to come at the expense of someone else's feelings. I don't think I would have figured that out on my own if it weren't for the situation with Mrs. Johnson. If there's one thing I'd want to share with others who might find themselves in a similar situation, it's this: be mindful of your actions, especially when you're trying to be funny or lighten the mood. Sometimes, we get so caught up in making people laugh that we forget about the impact our words or actions can have. It's easy to assume that everyone will be in on the joke or that no one will take offense. But not everyone reacts the same way. People have different backgrounds, experiences, and sensitivities, and what might be funny to you could hurt someone else. And sometimes, those small moments, like showing a piece of paper that says it's snowing, can teach you the biggest lessons. It's easy to get lost in the excitement of making people laugh, but real growth comes from being aware of how your actions affect others. Humor can be a powerful tool for connection, but only when it's used in a way that respects people's boundaries. My advice? Take a moment to think before you act. If you're ever in a situation where you're tempted to pull a prank or joke around, ask yourself, is this something that will make people laugh together, or is it at someone's expense? The difference can change everything. And if you mess up, don't be afraid to own it and apologize. That's how you learn and grow. I didn't fully appreciate it at the time, but I'm thankful for that prank in 8th grade. It was the moment that pushed me to think beyond just being the class clown and realize that my humor, my actions, could make or break my relationships with others. It's funny how a moment of foolishness can lead to some of the most valuable lessons in life. And now, when I look back, I'm proud of how I handled it, how I was able to take responsibility and learn from my mistake. Because at the end of the day, we all mess up. What matters is how we handle it and what we take away from it. That's what makes all the difference. As time passed, I started to notice how my relationships with my classmates and teachers shifted. It wasn't a drastic change, but there was a subtle difference in how I interacted with people. The laughs felt different, lighter, less forced. I no longer needed to be the person who made everyone laugh at the expense of someone else. The weight that had once come with my pranks and jokes felt lighter. I started making connections that were based on mutual respect and understanding, not on making people the punchline. It wasn't just with my classmates either. My interactions with my family, especially with my parents, started to change too. I was starting to take more responsibility for my actions, and I realized that this lesson extended beyond just school. Humor and sarcasm weren't always the answer at home when things got tough. It wasn't about keeping the mood light all the time. Sometimes, it was about showing up, being honest, and understanding when to take things seriously. The lesson Mrs. Johnson taught me wasn't confined to school or just my peers. It affected how I saw myself and how I interacted with people in all areas of my life. It was like I was no longer playing a part in some comedy sketch. I was becoming someone who genuinely cared about how others felt, even if it meant holding back on the jokes once in a while. That realization wasn't immediate, though. It took time to unlearn old habits. I still cracked jokes, still tried to lighten the mood when things felt tense, but I did it with more sensitivity. I knew now that there was more to a good relationship, whether with a teacher, a friend, or family, than just laughter. There had to be understanding, kindness, and mutual respect. And that realization felt good. As I looked back on everything, I started to feel a sense of pride. Not because I had been some great person all along, but because I had learned and grown from the experience. I had taken a mistake, faced it head-on, and used it to become better, not just for others, but for myself too. That, I realized, was the real lesson. And that's something I carry with me to this day. You don't always have to be the life of the party to make a difference. Sometimes, you just have to show up as your true self, aware of the impact you have on the people around you. That's how you build better connections and stronger relationships, and it's how you grow as a person. As I continued to grow older, that prank in 8th grade stayed with me. In some ways, it shaped the way I approached decision-making and how I handled social situations. I realized that it wasn't just about doing the right thing or making the best joke, it was about considering the long-term effects of my actions, especially on the people around me. In high school, I found myself in situations where I could have gone back to old habits, cracking jokes to deflect uncomfortable situations or pulling pranks just to get attention. But I didn't. Instead, I started to lean into honesty more. When something didn't sit right with me, I didn't try to make light of it. I addressed it head-on, sometimes awkwardly, but always with more maturity than I had in the past. And you know what? People respected that. They appreciated it more than the constant jokes or sarcasm. It wasn't always easy, though. There were moments when I had to fight the urge to revert to old behaviors. Social situations can be awkward, and humor is often the go-to defense mechanism for dealing with uncomfortable moments. But I kept reminding myself of that day with Mrs. Johnson, of the lesson it taught me about the impact of my actions. It wasn't just a lesson about pranks, it was a lesson about personal integrity. I also started noticing the difference in how people interacted with me. I could tell that people felt more comfortable around me, more willing to engage in deeper, more meaningful conversations. They weren't afraid that I'd make them the punchline. They knew I respected their boundaries. And that respect started to pave the way for more genuine connections. As I made my way through high school, I often found myself reflecting on how far I'd come since that day in 8th grade. It wasn't just about giving up the pranks, it was about understanding that I had the power to affect people's lives with my words and actions. And I didn't want to waste that power on anything that wasn't truly worth it. Looking back, it's clear to me that this wasn't just a lesson about being funny or making people laugh. It was a lesson about understanding the deeper impact of my choices. It was about recognizing that what we put out into the world, whether through humor or our actions, has a ripple effect. And those ripples can either make things better or worse for the people we care about. That realization, along with the lessons I learned from Mrs. Johnson, shaped the way I approached nearly everything in life. And as I continue to navigate new challenges, I carry that understanding with me, knowing that the decisions I make today will impact not only my future but the futures of those around me. It wasn't until I was much older that I truly understood the power of an apology. When I was younger, I thought apologies were just something you said to clear the air, a way to make things feel okay again. But after the prank incident, I began to realize that a genuine apology, one that comes from a place of true understanding, has the ability to heal and repair relationships in ways that words or actions can't. I remember when I was in high school and I made a joke that, for a split second, crossed a line. I could tell by the way my friend's smile faded that my words had hit harder than I intended. In that moment, I didn't make a joke to deflect or try to lighten the mood like I would have in the past. I didn't cover it up with humor. I simply paused, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you feel that way." It was a small moment, but it changed everything. The air between us cleared immediately. He appreciated my apology, and more importantly, he respected that I took responsibility for what I'd said. That's when I realized how powerful it can be to own your mistakes, not just to say sorry, but to show that you genuinely understand the impact of your actions and want to make things right. It's funny, because when I was younger, I thought an apology was a weakness, something that made you vulnerable. But now, I see it as strength. It's strength to admit that you were wrong, to take a step back and acknowledge the effect your words or actions had on others. That's something I hadn't fully appreciated before, but the prank from 8th grade had already begun teaching me the value of humility and empathy. I took this newfound understanding with me into adulthood. Whenever I make a mistake, whether at work or in personal relationships, I don't shy away from apologizing. I know now that it's not about admitting defeat, it's about acknowledging my humanity. People make mistakes. We all do. The key is to learn from them, to grow, and to take responsibility for the impact they have. So, if there's one piece of advice I'd give someone based on everything I've experienced, it's this: don't be afraid to apologize. Do it with sincerity, not as a way to save face, but as a way to show that you value the other person's feelings. Own up to your mistakes and show people that you're capable of growth. You'd be amazed at how much stronger your relationships will be as a result. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. Now, as I look back on that day in 8th grade, the prank with the "it's snowing" piece of paper, I realize it was more than just a funny memory, it was a turning point in my life. It's one of those moments that, even though at the time it seemed trivial, ended up shaping my character in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. That moment taught me about humor and its power, both to unite and to harm. It made me aware that sometimes, our actions, no matter how innocent they might seem, can have lasting consequences. It taught me that the people around me, whether friends, teachers, or even strangers, deserve to be treated with respect, not just as subjects for a laugh. It's about balancing humor with kindness and being aware of how others perceive us. Not everyone is in on the joke, and sometimes, that's okay. What I didn't realize back then was that a single moment could influence so much of my future. That prank wasn't just something funny to talk about, it was a lesson in empathy, responsibility, and self-awareness. As I've grown older, I've seen the impact of those lessons in every aspect of my life. Whether in friendships, family relationships, or even in the workplace, I've come to understand the importance of thoughtful action. I'm not perfect, and I still make mistakes, but I've learned to approach life with more consideration for others. That day with Mrs. Johnson and my classmates remains a vivid memory. It wasn't just the prank that stuck with me, but the lessons I learned from it. It's a reminder that we're all human, and it's okay to make mistakes as long as we learn from them. And more importantly, it's a reminder that laughter is best when shared, and humor should never come at the expense of someone else's dignity. To anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation, where a joke or prank gets out of hand, my advice is simple: pause, reflect, and consider the impact of your actions before you go further. It's never too late to learn from your mistakes and make things right. And don't be afraid to grow. Growth comes from understanding, from taking responsibility, and from using your experiences to build a better future for yourself and those around you. Looking back, I'm grateful for that prank in 8th grade. It taught me more than just how to make people laugh, it taught me how to be a better person. And for that, I'll always be thankful.